Thank you very much, Your Eminence. I think our proceedings this morning have been given a solemn and serious atmosphere because of the atrocity in Jerusalem. I have myself seen so many such atrocities related to places of worship, whether they are churches or mosques and indeed synagogues. This is a new turn that terrorism is taking, and I hope that everyone present here can condemn without reserve what has happened this morning. My understanding of the Quran is that one of the things that it is committed to doing is to protect precisely attacks on churches and synagogues. So it is very paradoxical that this should be happening in the name of Islam, and I hope that our Muslim friends here will be quite clear about the teaching of their faith in this respect. Well, so much has been said already about the family, it's difficult to know what one can add. And the fact of the matter is that the news is mixed. So more people are getting married, actually, in terms of sheer numbers, but also more marriages are breaking up, as you have heard, and more people are simply not getting married. So how are we to assess this situation? Well, some years ago, a center in Cambridge called the Center for the History of Population and Social Structure, rather a strange name, but they did longitudinal and cross-cultural research on the nature of the family over many hundreds of years, where records were available, and over many different cultures. And they discovered, to their surprise, I think, that in all cultures and throughout the ages, the father, mother, and the children have been at the center of the family. Even where there are extended families, and this was mentioned yesterday, even where there are extended families, the father and the mother and the children are at the nucleus of it. In fact, this is the true meaning of the term nuclear family. Not isolated from everything else, but the nucleus, as you know, is the center of the atom or the cell. It is what feeds everything else. Similarly, another Cambridge center, I will be even-handed later on, the Center for Family Research showed that unless conflict is violent between the parents, children prefer their parents to stay together. Now, all of this reflects a lot of work that has been done by the School of the Sociology of the Family since the 1940s, which has shown what has already been called here the natural or the normative family. This is not to say that there are no exceptions, of course there are, but if we are looking for a definitive shape of the family, for example, for social policy, then this is it. Now, of course, the Christian Church has not invented the family. We've seen that already in our proceedings here. It is a natural institution, and the Church, in its understanding of marriage, has actually not hesitated to borrow and to build on what it has borrowed. So it has naturally borrowed from the elder brother, from the Hebraic tradition, and it has also, to some extent, borrowed from Roman practice and Roman custom. The Greeks, in this respect, were more difficult because of Plato's statism and the desire that all the upper classes should forego their family life and allow them to be brought up in nurseries so they can do other things. Does that remind you of anything today? And Aristotle, of course, in my view anyway, took an overly biological view of marriage, which is included in the Christian view, but is not exhausted. The Christian view is not exhausted by it. There were, however, some special contributions that the church did make. And one of them was the emphasis on consent between those getting married. I was a bishop in Pakistan at one time, and when I was, I remember conducting a wedding where the mother was answering for the bride. So in the end, I had to stop the ceremony, and I said, well, no, the bride has to answer. So the idea of consent is very important, and of course of mutuality, which we already find in the letters of St. Paul to the Ephesians and the Colossians, that it's not just responsibility on one side and rights on the other, but there is a mutuality of rights and responsibilities within the relationship of marriage. This mutuality is, of course, based on the Judeo-Christian idea, which has been mentioned so many times already, of the one flesh union between man and woman. Now, of course, I could say many things, but the one name that has not so far been mentioned, at least in my understanding, is that of Augustine of Hippo. And I don't think we can have a colloquium on marriage and the family without mentioning Augustine. His two great books on marriage, which can be criticized, but they remain great. And there are three things that Augustine says about marriage in these books, taken together, which I think deserve a mention. One is the idea that man and woman come together and need to stay together for the sake of children. As Rabbi Sachs was saying yesterday, human children take an awfully long time to grow up. And that is one reason, obviously, for the parents to stay together. But Augustine added to this the idea that this was also for the security and the well-being of the partners themselves. So not only for the children, but the partners too. This is what you might call a contractual view of marriage. Augustine doesn't end there, of course. He goes on to say that there is also a mutuality of commitment. So those who are married recognize one another as human beings invested with a dignity that cannot be taken away, that they are persons, each in their own right, and that personhood has to be respected by the one of the other. And the third, of course, is the idea in Augustine of sacramental union, where he develops what is in Ephesians chapter 5, that Archbishop Laffitte spoke about yesterday. The relationship is so close that we cannot any longer speak of two, but must now speak only of one. You see, that is the paradox, that the two now can be spoken of as one, of sacramental union. Now, the thing about Augustine is that people criticize him, and sometimes rightly, but he is difficult to get rid of. I mean, that's the... because if we look at the Enlightenment, as so many people do these days, we find that there are partial reflections of Augustine in the leading Enlightenment thinkers. So John Locke, for instance, emphasizes the contractual nature of marriage. And precisely the argument that parents need to stay together because of their children. Now, this leads Locke, I have to say, to say that marriage in this sense can be brought to an end once the parents have done their duty by their children. This is, of course, a weakness in the contractual argument, and that is why Augustine had supplemented it with the need of security for both partners. Nevertheless, that aspect is there in Locke. Kant, as you may imagine, somebody said Emmanuel yesterday, and I thought they were going to follow it up with Kant, but actually it wasn't. But again, Kant needs to be mentioned, as you might expect. In Kant, the emphasis is on duty, on the unbreakable promise. If you have made a vow, you've got to keep the vow. And of course, Kant would say that not just about marriage, but about other things, loyalty to one's country, for instance. And then Hegel speaks of the mystical union between those who are married, coming very close to Augustine at this point. Although the Church's view of marriage as a sacramental union is, of course, based on the idea that it reflects the union between Christ and his Church, for Hegel, it is really based on the nature of man and woman. And I've often wondered whether the Anglican emphasis on marriage as a creation ordinance is similar to this kind of idea. Well, brothers and sisters, the point is that each of these views of marriage, and of course they belong together and not separately, is under threat. So what has happened to contract? Well, no-fault divorce without consent, you've heard of that, has put an end to the contractual view even of marriage. It is now, they say, easier to get out of marriage than out of your mortgage that you've taken out to buy your house. What about the commitment to one another? Well, Anthony Giddens, friend of ours, his book written a long time ago, The Transformation of Intimacy, posits pure relationship. What is pure relationship? It is a relationship that lasts only as long as the partners want it to last. So what happens to commitment? Unconditional commitment. That's gone out of the window. And what about sacramental union, where there are not two any longer, but only one? Well, I think false ideas of autonomy, which are a mutation, I think, in the end of the idea of inalienable dignity, which is a biblical idea, but autonomy has put an end to our need for depending on others. Now, in this situation, the public doctrine of marriage in certain countries in the West is in jeopardy. I mean, that's the point that I would want to make. For centuries, many countries have had a public doctrine of marriage based on the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, that is being abandoned without research, without any thought of consequences, and in fact, flying in the face of facts. So why do we need a public doctrine of marriage in these countries, in our world? I'm so glad that a representative of the Catholic Conference of Bishops of England and Wales is actually present, at least one of them, maybe there's more than one, because they published a document some time ago called The True Meaning of Marriage. And I'm sure they'll be able to talk about it better than I can. But I think they tried to show in that document why we need a public doctrine of marriage. And the reasons that they gave were, first of all, that it is good for children, that all the outcomes for children, whether educational or social or relational, depend to a great extent on being brought up in a situation where their mother and their father is present with them in the course of their development. Secondly, they said, it is good for the partners themselves, for the spouses themselves. All the research shows that people live better, live longer, and are perhaps even happier if they're married than if they're not married. And thirdly, of course, it is for the good of society. It is for the common good because it is a basic unit of a stable society. Human beings have rich networks of relationships. Of course they do. We have relationships with our parents, with others, our cousins, our nephews, nieces, uncles, aunts, all of those things, and of course friends. Some of these relationships may need to be recognized and even to be protected by law. When the Civil Partnerships Bill was going through Parliament, some of us tried, to extend the bill to cover all those who, for one reason or another, had to live together. It may be siblings living together, it may be a mother and a daughter, there are many examples, or it may just be friends. And in the House of Lords, actually, the amendment was passed. It was reversed later in the Commons. I leave you to judge the wisdom of that. But of course, it is true that some relationships may need to be protected. Some people may feel that their relationships need some kind of legal recognition and protection. It is quite wrong, however, to say this relationship needs protection and recognition, therefore let us call it marriage. I mean, that's the kind of category mistake that has been made. Marriage is a particular kind of institution, ordered to particular kinds of goods, and you cannot enhance other relationships by calling them marriage. What, in fact, we need to do is to strengthen marriage, as has been set out time and again in this colloquium, in a number of ways, and I just want to mention one or two before I sit down. One is proper preparation for marriage. The tragedy in so many places is that people enter marriage without adequate preparation. Now, the churches, and I'm sure people of other faiths present here will also say this, have considerable experience of preparation. I have to say, hand on heart, our preparation is not always as thorough as it ought to be. It is not as good as it should be. The press delights in telling us that more and more people in Britain, for instance, are undergoing civil marriage without the benefit of the church and of the clergy. Well, okay, but what about preparation? Who is doing their preparation for them getting married? I was at a civil wedding quite recently, and the groom had taken more alcohol than he should, and he was having another drink. So I said, do you really need this drink? And he said, oh yes, because I've got my preparation with the officiant in a few minutes. This was an hour before the wedding. Well, this is simply not good enough. We need thorough preparation for marriage, and in many different ways now we have DVDs and all sorts of things that people can use, resources that can be used for this. But if there is preparation, what should there be in the preparation? What kind of things do we need to talk about? And there are certainly two that I want to mention. One is the need for the integration, and this is particularly so for men. I look forward to hearing what women have to say about this, but the need for integration between the sexual instinct, for instance, and our affective nature. In the West, the sexual instinct is now being projected to such an extent that men's capacity for affection is falling into the background. And this impoverishes the relationship. And not only the capacity of men for affection, but also for nurture. Unless these are integrated, we will find that marriage will soon hit the rocks. The second aspect in preparation, which I feel is very important, is the question of what has been called stages of intimacy, or aspects of intimacy. That is to say, you know, there is courtship and there's the honeymoon and everyone's very happy. Well, that's great. But what about what follows? You see, human beings, even married couples are human beings. When they come to share a space, well, you know what happens when human beings share a common space. They fight about it. And there is competition, even in a married relationship, for space and resources. That creates conflict between the partners. But what we have to show them, and this can be done by psychologists, indeed clergy have a lot of experience of this kind of thing, they can be shown, we can be shown, that this competition and conflict is not the end. It is only the beginning. And this can be followed by cooperation and that oneness of mind and heart and body that the sacramental union is all about. But so often, because there is no preparation, at the very first hurdle, the marriage cracks and sometimes breaks. Secondly, in terms of what we need to do, there's preparation. There is then what has been called parenting. I don't like the term. I think we should probably call it mothering and fathering. Because what we are talking about is showing mothers and fathers how to be mothers and fathers. Because they have grown up in a situation where role modeling is absent, indeed sometimes frowned upon. And yet all the research is showing, this has also been mentioned yesterday, all the research is showing that children relate to their parents in a way, to their fathers and to their mothers differently. So children relate to their fathers, even in play, differently from how they relate to their mothers. And the relationship with both parents is important. I mean, so many of the decisions that our courts have made about access for fathers in the event of a breakdown has led to the alienation of fathers from their children. What a tragedy that is. There are some militant groups in Britain now of fathers seeking access to their children. Well, I don't endorse all their methods, but I can certainly see the problem that they are addressing in their own way. Mothering, we need to teach parents, mothers and fathers, how to be mothers and fathers so that their children's identity may be established properly. They may be capable of entering well-balanced relationships. And so in the end, that they themselves may be able better to enter the marriage relationship and to flourish in it. Thirdly, preparation, parenting, and then prenuptials. Now, the press, the media, by prenuptials means quite often agreement between very wealthy people about how much they will get if the marriage breaks up. That is not what I mean. What I mean, and this is a new thing that in the United States seems to be tried anyway, is that because of the encroachment of no-fault divorce without consent, some couples are being encouraged to and voluntarily undertaking an agreement before their marriage which prescribes the circumstances in which a marriage might break down. So not just because I've grown out of it. I mean, that's quite a popular argument these days, isn't it? Or we are incompatible or whatever. It would have to be something like desertion or cruelty or adultery or whatever a serious cause like that may be. But it would also contain a provision for mandatory counseling if a marriage runs into difficulty, and that kind of thing. It is, I think, worth thinking about how to encourage people to take marriage seriously, also in this way. And then finally, in terms of what we might do, there is the question of how the state recognizes marriage. I was saying yesterday at the press conference that in Britain now, there are two streams of law about marriage. There is the Same-Sex Marriage Act, which has a view of marriage, which is now law. But because the Church of England is an established church, the canon law of the church, which teaches that marriage is between a man and a woman, retains the force of public law. So what's the state going to do? What will it promote? Certainly, from our point of view, there must be preference for marriage in the tax system, for instance. This can be done in a whole number of ways, whether it is the married couple's allowance that was taken away from them because it was seen to be discriminatory against those who are not married, or whether it is one partner ascribing their tax allowance to the other for tax advantage, or the recognition of children, as I gather is the case in Italy, where there are children, marriage is supported by the state. We are facing, in some countries anyway, a critical situation where marriage as we understand it may simply disappear in some years. And we have to act, not just the church of course needs to act and to teach its own people the true meaning of marriage, but to encourage the state. When I talk about preparation, I don't mean just the churches. If more and more people are getting married in the register office, then that means the state has to be involved in preparation. How will the state support parenting, the mothering and fathering that is necessary for flourishing families? How will the church get beyond this business of no-fault divorce without consent to urging people and encouraging people to take marriage seriously? And then there is also the question of money. What is the state going to do in terms of putting its money where it sometimes anyway puts its mouth? Thank you very much indeed.